And I'm trying to recruit the exit counselors. I'm saying, we have a course that can help you, at the Ask to Prepare course. Come, I'm trying to recruit them. They didn't fall for it, obviously, but then the other two exit counselors began sharing their stories. Both of them were former Scientologists. And they became a lot harder to discount what they were saying because they knew the language. These were the first people I ever met outside of Scientology who knew the language. They spoke like Scientologists. They knew the doctrine. All this time when I'm talking to my parents, we didn't understand each other. I couldn't communicate with them. And I just figured my parents just don't get it. They're just being suppressive. But these exit counselors understood everything, and that made a whole lot of difference. It was very hard to discount what they said. They described their cult experiences to me. They showed me videotapes, newspaper articles about Scientology. Then they showed me OT3, which L. Ron Hubbard says will kill you if you read it before you're ready to read it. Actually, it's nothing more than a science fiction story that wouldn't make a good grade B movie. But I didn't want to read it. And my parents couldn't believe that I was too scared to read it. And in my mind, I was justifying it by saying, I'm not afraid to read it. I just think the exit counselors are trying to set me up for something. I don't want to play their game. I don't have to go along with this if I don't want to. I didn't think I was scared. I just didn't want to play along. Whatever the reason, the point is I didn't read it. The mind control worked. At this point, my friend Matt grabbed the OT3 away from the exit counselors, leaped out of his chair, stood in the middle of the room, and started reading it out loud.
It was frightening and unnerving to see our son, who was a college student several days before, afraid to read or listen to OT3. What did they do to him? And how can this written page be harmful? We were confused. It was suggested the next morning by the exit counselors that Bob and I not attend that day's session, and we very nervously paced back and forth in the motel lobby.
By early that afternoon, I came to the realization that I was not going to handle my PTS condition this way. I went down to a payphone in the hotel lobby and called the Sea Organization, and they reminded me that I had been kidnapped. At this point, I decided to leave.
My sister came down to the lobby to tell us that Paul was leaving. Barbara and I ran up the steps, not even waiting to use the elevator. As I entered the room, I realized this was maybe my last shot ever, and I didn't want to lose it. I figured there was nothing to lose by telling Paul just how we felt. No holes barred. I told him first that we loved him, and the love was unconditional. There was nothing he could ever do to change that, and that he was always welcome in our home, anytime, anywhere we were. No questions asked. But he had to understand our position in this. One, we were very disappointed he was making this decision without looking at all the evidence and seeing both sides of the story. But more important than that, he'd be recruiting other people into this organization, causing their families the same heartache that we were going through. And that was intolerable for us. And for that reason, his mother and I would start speaking out, warning people about Scientology, where and whenever we were given the opportunity to do so. So that for every one person he got into Scientology, we would keep 10 out. Paul, and I also told him, I would do whatever I could to destroy this organization.
As I prepared to leave, I hugged my parents goodbye and kissed them, and we told each other that we love each other. It was the first time I'd ever seen my father cry. As I called a cab and got inside the cab, my friend Matt and one of the exit counselors got in the cab with me, and I went to the train station, and I was going to take a train back to Manhattan to go back to Scientology. And as I'm waiting for the train to arrive, the exit counselor and Matt kept trying to convince me to come back to the hotel just for another hour, just another hour. You can always leave later on. Just stay for another hour. What do you have to lose? And they were begging and pleading me just to come back just for a little bit. And I refused to do so. What did happen, though, before I left the hotel was one of the exit counselors photocopied a lot of his information for me and gave it to me. So I had this information in my hand, and then the exit counselor said, well, look, if you don't want to come back to the hotel, at least start reading the stuff I gave you. Start looking at it, and I didn't want to do that either. When the train came, as I got onto the train, I turned around, and I saw Matt standing there. And I tell you, I have never seen a human being with such a hopeless, terrified look on his face as I saw at that moment. He literally looked like he had just lost his best friend. And as I waved goodbye to him, he didn't even have the energy to wave back. His hand just kind of went up like this as I got on the train. And that image of my best friend was kind of drilled into my head. And as I'm sitting on the train, it kept like a bad movie. It was like a big flashback. I just couldn't shake it. I was totally confused. My head was spinning. And of course, the train ride was about an hour and a half, and I started getting bored, so I just figured I'd start reading the information that I had.
When Matt and the exit counselor returned to the room without Paul, Barbara and I were devastated. All was lost. The place looked like the Battle of Gettysburg. Even the professional exit counselors were stressed out even more than we were. Barbara and I went home because there was nothing much else we could do.
That evening, we were very depressed when we returned home. But we received a call from our daughter in college, who was in Ohio at the time, and that cheered us up a bit. And then we realized we had to tell the family. The logistics had made it impossible for her to get involved in the exit counseling. We also had her as an ace in the hole if needed in the future, and she could always keep a line of communication open if necessary.
On Friday, April 6th, Barbara and I tried to regroup. We went to see our rabbi at our temple, and even though this was Passover, one of his busy seasons, he gave us a lot of time and compassion. The only problem was he knew less about cults at this point than we did. Barbara and I went home and decided to write some letters. First to our son to restate our position and to make it clear how we felt. And the second to the director of the Sea Org to let Scientology know that we considered Scientology now to be totally responsible for the well-being of our son and that we would hold them responsible for it. Barbara and I spent the day writing, rewriting, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. About 5 p.m. when we were just about finished, there was a key in the door. Paul was home, threw 2 bags on the floor, and said, "I'm home, my trip to Florida is on." It was like winning the lottery. I was sure that Paul looked at the information and then told Scientology where to stick it.
That's not exactly what happened. When I got back to Scientology, I was told to report to the Organization of Special Affairs, OSA, and I was interrogated for 8 hours. Every single detail of the past, 48 hours I had to recount. I had to give them the names of the exit counselors. I only knew the first names of the exit counselors, but that was okay because they knew the last names of the exit counselors. I told them everything they had told me, went through it in complete detail. And then they started asking me what my parents were saying, what my parents were going to do. And I told them that my parents had threatened to spend the rest of their life destroying this organization. I also told them, of course, that I had seen OT3, and I started asking a lot of questions about it. You see, the exit counselors did not succeed in convincing me that Scientology was bad. I still believed in Scientology, but they did manage to put questions into my head that were not there before, and I started asking them. And of course, the leaders became very uncomfortable with this. Finally, they declared me a PTS type A, which means that I must be disconnected from Scientology. I can no longer be a Scientologist. And of course, I was devastated because I dropped out of school for this, quit my job, I gave up everything for, and now I can't be a Scientologist. What do I do now? I was devastated. And the last thing they said to me as this interrogation session ended was, whatever you do, don't ever, ever, ever talk about Scientology ever again. The interrogation session ended at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they were nice to me. They actually let me sleep over. And when I woke up the next day, I packed my bags and came home. And when I got home, I called up Matt, told him our trip to Florida was back on, and we left the next day, as originally planned. Couldn't have had better timing, huh? Well, Matt was actually we didn't talk about Scientology during our vacation, and Matt was really uncomfortable. He got sick on a roller coaster, which is not something which is, usual for him. We went to Disney World. And I couldn't understand why Matt was not feeling so well. I personally thought I was fine. I was angry at my parents for getting me kicked out of Scientology, and I was upset that I was kicked out of Scientology, but other than that, I was still a normal, thinking, rational person. I couldn't understand why Matt was being so torn up inside.